Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Neuroqueering podcast. I'm your host, Pasha Marlowe. This is part two. I did a previous episode just before going to speak at the ADHD International Conference in November 2023. And the first part was about the intersection of neurodiversity and queerness, neuroqueering. Good news, the presentation was very well attended. In fact, there was standing room only and a waiting line out the door. So it was really needed, frankly, the representation of neuroqueering and LGBTQ, gender affirming, and neurodiversity affirming practices at the conference. So I'm really glad it made such a big impact. So this is part two because I really want to dig into the framework. So, just as a review, in the first episode, I did talk about the neurodiversity paradigm based on the social model. We talked about some of the more inclusive language and depathologizing language we could use. And we also talked about how if we serve neurodivergent people, we need to be able to serve also queer people because the Venn diagram is a circle, as they say. The correlation just runs too deep. And so, to review briefly, we need to understand that queer, trans, genderqueer, and neurodivergent people are all highly marginalized, all are misunderstood, underrepresented, and have high mental health support needs. Some of the needs that you will find in neuroqueer folks, and for sake of this episode, I'm using neuroqueer as a intersectionality between neurodivergence and queerness, being LGBTQIA plus. Um, Common issues are dual stigma with intersecting identities, isolation, which leads to often depression and further mental health issues. The aspect of coming out twice, and I went over these in more detail in the previous episode. I'm just reviewing now. Sensory issues. This is true for meds, hormones, binders, birth control, medical trauma. This is a big one, and I don't know anyone neurodivergent who hasn't experienced some medical trauma. But the pathologization of LGBTQIA plus and neurodivergence and mental health for that matter, the stigma, there's laws to prevent gender affirming care. Um, this is a common challenge for the neuroqueer community, and then safety. And I ended the last episode talking about psychological safety, but I do also want to make a point to note that physical safety, like baseline safety, I'm hearing from people that because of the economy, the housing crisis, that people are struggling to make ends meet. People are struggling to put food on the table. People are struggling to pay rent. This is on top of all of the challenges neurodivergent and LGBTQIA people are already experiencing and all the intersectionalities um, from there. And so just noting the emotional, the physical, and the energetic toll that is taking on our community. So today I wanted to introduce a framework that will help if any of you are out there supporting or caring for or treating neuroqueer folks. I want to say that leaders, not just doctors and psychiatrists, and not just teachers, but parents, friends, like you all have such a big part in the health and wellness and well-being of neuroqueer folks. So whoever you are listening, know that you do not need to have a title or any fancy letters after your name to be able to make a really big change and impact to your neuroqueer friends and family. At the root of any good framework is intersectionality. And the concept of intersectionality refers to various intersecting aspects of social location, a person's location in society based on ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, neurodivergence, etc. They interact and create interrelated systems of oppression. And in the presentation, I showed the intersectionality. It's like a wheel. It's a diagram, and it shows, if you're in the center of the wheel, you have a lot of power and privilege. And then on the outside of the wheel, again, more of the marginalized, intersecting identities. And it was very impactful for the people in the room who are neurodivergent and queer, and chronically ill and disabled, apparent and non-apparent disability, to realize um, how much their intersecting identities pose a challenge. And sometimes it's just interesting to see a graphic and see how power and privilege plays out in our society. When we embrace intersectionality, we find ourselves not just including, but really seeking out voices of people with the most intersecting marginalized identities. I often ask leaders, especially in corporations, like, who is not talking on your teams, in your meetings? Who is not at the table? Who was not even invited to the room? Unless you intentionally include, you will unintentionally exclude. So the framework that I'm proposing is a combination of ask, affirm, and advocate. I believe asking is underutilized. Like, asking people, the number one way to understand and care for people who are different than you, ask them, who are you? How do you identify? What do you need? What do I not know that would help me understand you better? There are some simple shape shifting questions that allow people to feel seen and heard and believed. So the best leaders are curious and open and willing to learn and unlearn, and empathetic and willing to ask questions instead of saying, how are you? Just, and not even wait for the response. If you are going to ask, how are you? Wait for the answer, empathetically and compassionately listen, but maybe even ask, who are you? Instead of how are you? Affirm. There's neurodiversity affirming practices, and this is based on the idea that individuals have differences, not disorders, not deficiencies, but differences that do not need to be fixed, deficits that do not need to be fixed. It's a strength-based approach, the neurodiversity affirming practices. It's competency-based, it's strength-based, it's empowering, not pathologizing. Gender affirming. A trans or gender diverse person determines what is right for them and how they define their gender. Gender affirmation may involve social, medical, and legal steps that affirm a person's gender. You would be surprised at how many people disregard somebody's gender identity, misuse pronouns, don't use pronouns, chosen pronouns, and chosen names, or don't even believe that how somebody identifies. And this happens with parents too. Believe your children, believe somebody when they tell you who they are. I want you to be strength based as a leader, assuming competency, assuming that no matter who we are, we can choose and recognize how we want to identify. Identity first language. Rather than saying a person with autism, an autistic person, a person with disability, a disabled person. I identify as ADHD, an autistic ADHDer. I am queer. I don't have queerness. I don't have autism. It's innate. It's who I am. So it's an interesting conversation when we talk about saying I have ADHD. And I think the reason why people have a hard time saying I am ADHD is because ADHD is a terrible label. I am attention deficit hyperactive activity disorder. So the two D's alone are pathologizing. So in the future, I hope we can drop the disorder and maybe even drop the deficit, and talk about the attention and focus differences, but not from that pathologizing way. So I say I am an autistic ADHD, or I am ADHD. But it's interesting just to recognize, do you say I have, whether it is ADHD or autism or chronic illness, or what do you say? How do you identify? Interesting conversation to have with yourself and others. Use preferred names and pronouns. This is suicide prevention. Use validating names and never dead names. Use the proper pronouns, please. Use inclusive and non pathologizing language. So, again, difference or diversity rather than deficit or disorder. Just drop the disorder. Autism spectrum disorder, autism. Bipolar disorder, bipolar, right? Drop the disorder. Honor lived experiences. It is very challenging to get a formal diagnosis. It is challenging to get a doctor's appointment. It is challenging to get medicine. So understand the inaccessibility and inequity of that, and understand that the people who identify as neurodivergent, for example, somebody who identifies as autistic, for example, has done a shit ton of research, reading, listening, talking, podcasting, TikToking, articles, research, all of it to come to that conclusion. By the time they go to a doctor, psychiatrist, a therapist, a coach, they have already identified with likely all of the traits of autism, and fill in the blank, ADHD too. Honor lived experiences. Believe people when they tell you who they are. For therapists and coaches out there, share your own personal stories, share your identity. Relatability is accessibility. So rather than being a blank slate therapist or coach, recognize that you offering your identity and leading with vulnerability liberates your clients to do the same. Which brings me to advocate. Stay informed. There is changing language, changing inclusive and affirming language. There's changing laws around gender affirming care. We need to be trauma informed. And that doesn't mean you have to be able to treat trauma, but certainly understand the impact of trauma. Understand how the impact of trauma affects one's ability to function. Recognize the needs. Those are the needs I mentioned before with the dual stigma and the isolation, increase in substance abuse, increase in suicidal ideation, maybe even offer accommodations and assistance before people ask. Can we offer solutions before there's a problem? We're going to get to that in a moment with inclusive design. Honor people's boundaries. Honor boundaries of your neuroqueer friends, family, clients, the boundaries they set around their ability, but also their capacity, and teach them to create strong boundaries and honor them and model that for them. Ability versus capacity is we shouldn't do everything we can do. In fact, if we do everything we can do, we will burn out. So we need to honor our capacity. You'll hear the term spoons. Have I run out of spoons for the day? Um, and I like that terminology because we could, within the community, say, I have no more spoons. And we're like, I'm out. I can't learn anything else. I can't do anything else. Whatever I did before, whether it was go to the grocery store or walk my dog or do a job interview, requires spoons and energy. So our best looks different every day. Sometimes my best looks like writing resumes and doing a bunch of podcasts and presenting at conferences. And sometimes my best looks like napping and snuggling with my dogs and my kids. So we have to honor our capacity and our ability and encourage people, your loved ones, to do the same. Let's talk quickly about accessibility and inclusive design. So using inclusive design for meetings and gatherings is where we assume there are needs. So when I presented at the ADHD conference, I offered closed captions in my live presentation on the screen. Nobody in the room needed to say, I have difficulty hearing. Nobody in the room needed to say, it would help me to read as well as listen. Nobody in the room needed to ask me for that accommodation. I assumed it. Maybe it was necessary for somebody, maybe not, but it definitely helped many people in the room, right? And so when we offer needs for the most marginalized identities, everyone benefits. This could be transcripts, closed captions. This could be offering quiet rooms, noise canceling headphones. This could be offering remote work. Um, solve for one and serve many. Let's talk quickly about safe space versus brave space. We cannot guarantee safe space, even if it is our intention. So rather than saying this is a safe space, which really implies that you're guaranteeing it, intend for it to be a safe space. And you can even say that I intend for this to be a safe space. And we need to hold leaders accountable for creating safe spaces and psychologically safe spaces, because trauma and conflict will happen and there needs to be systems in place to handle those things. But because we can't guarantee safety, it's best not to say this is a safe space, because then for the people who still don't feel safe, they actually feel less safe and more excluded. There's also some talk, and Brene Brown brought this up. How about say brave space instead of safe space? But saying brave space is not always equitable, because it takes more energy for marginalized people to be brave just to leave the house. So they're already brave to leave the house. They're already brave and using up far more energy to maybe even get to work, right? And then we're asking them to also be brave and also share and also teach us. We need actually leaders to hold safe space and brave space. Folks who are holding more power and privilege need to be the ones who are braver, not the people who are marginalized and have to be brave and are exhausted every day. And again, I will say again, honor lived experience. This goes for neurodiversity affirming practices and gender affirming practices. Believe people when they tell you who they are. Poet Andrea Gibson says, our ears never stop growing. It is a biological guide for living. Our ears are asking us to listen more and more closely. Openness is a superpower. I love that. I love that. I highly value openness and curiosity. I want you to be proactive in your leadership. I want you to be non performative in your leadership, authentic in your inclusiveness. Let your openness, willingness to learn and unlearn, and your big ears be your legacy as parents, as providers. Please support and elevate neuroqueer voices. Please reach out to me if you'd like to continue this conversation. I would love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, Pasha Marlowe. You can find me on TikTok and Instagram at Neuroqueer Coach. You can email me, Pasha at pashamarlowe.com. I welcome conversation. My dog right now is conversing with me saying, walk me, mom. So I'm going to go do that. Pleasure talking to you all today. And I hope to talk again soon. Happy neuroqueering.